Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Thale, the president of WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. I want to welcome you all to this online webinar on human rights in Bolsonaro's Brazil, the fight for ethnic and minority rights during the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to begin by welcoming all of you. I recognize we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're in the midst of social distancing, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to be part of this online webinar. I want to especially thank my colleague Jimena Sanchez here at WOLA for working to organize this, our partners at Race and Equality who are co-sponsoring this event, and Carlos Quesada in particular, and our colleagues from the Arns Commission and Conectas in Brazil who are here to share their perspective on the ongoing issues that Brazil faces. This is obviously a really important issue. Brazil is a major economic, political, and social actor in the Western Hemisphere and in the world much more at large. What happens in Brazil matters in Brazil itself, to ethnic and minority groups, to the community as a whole, and it matters to the region because of its impact in the Western Hemisphere and beyond. The issues of race and gender, of indigenous rights, of LGBTQ rights, of the rights of vulnerable groups have been long-standing challenges in Brazil. They intensified with the arrival of the Bolsonaro administration, and they become even more intense and more challenging in the days immediately in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's really important for all of us to focus on this. We're really lucky to have the panelists we have. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Jimena Sanchez. Jimena has coordinated our work on Colombia for many years, followed other issues in the region, and has led our work with colleagues, responding to colleagues in Brazil on the challenges the country faces there. So, Jimena, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So as Jeff said, I'm Jimena Sanchez, Director for the Andes here at WOLA. Very happy to welcome all of you to this very relevant and important webinar with experts on Bolsonaro and his past 15 months in office. We are grateful to Race and Equality, our partners in co-sponsoring this. And just a few housekeeping notes before we start. We will be hearing from each of our panelists for about 12 minutes, and then we will be doing question and answers. If you would like to send in a question, we ask that you please tweet it with the hashtag WOLA Brazil. So it's hashtag WOLA Brazil, and we will be compiling those and getting to those at the end of the discussion. So since January 2019, Brazil saw a major drastic change when Jair Bolsonaro, a right-wing populist, began his term in office. He was a candidate who campaigned on an openly hardline security and pro-gun, racist, anti-indigenous, misogynistic, homophobic, xenophobic, global climate change denying, and pro-evangelical platform, and now he's in office. Today, we want to know what has happened since he's been in office the past 16 months, and how much of his agenda he was able to actually advance. What the challenges are, what the international community, especially those of us in the US, can do about it. So a few words before turning to our panelists, especially on the Brazil-US relationship. We've seen that Bolsonaro has moved away from Brazil's decades-long traditional commitment to autonomy and very much aligned himself with the US. There's basically a meeting of the minds between Bolsonaro and Trump on many issues, such as economic, commercial, public security, migration, climate change, Israel, ethnic minorities, LGBT persons, and now even COVID. So we've seen that they've had 2 formal presidential visits where they've shown a very open kind of bromance where they each praise each other's and each other's policies. And the last meeting took place in March in Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate, which was surrounded by tremendous controversy when much of the Bolsonaro delegation upon return to Brazil ended up testing positive for the virus. Trump has really welcomed Bolsonaro's rapprochement and sought to strengthen US-Brazil relations. We've seen that his administration has tried to bolster bilateral cooperation on counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, and that Brazil has been designated a major non-NATO ally. The two countries have already agreed on several measures to facilitate trade and investment. There have been a few bumps when it's come to China, and the Trump administration has maintained certain import restrictions and threatened to impose tariffs. However, in general, the relationship seems to be going strong. And we see also that US conservatives have broadly embraced Eduardo Bolsonaro's son. As a result of this deepening of ties, we've seen some responses from the US Congress. The US Congress has expressed renewed interest in Brazil and US-Brazil relations, something that they weren't very much involved in for the past 2 decades. The Amazon fires prompted an appropriation of $15 million in foreign assistance programs to the Amazon, including $5 million to address fires in the Further Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2020. There have been other legislative proposals introduced to attempt to support Amazon conservation efforts and efforts to restrict U.S. defense and trade relations with Brazil in response to these forestations. The more progressive voices in our Congress have also expressed deep concern about the state of democracy and human rights in Brazil. We now have a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that directs the Secretary of Defense in coordination with Secretary of State to submit a report to Congress regarding Brazil's human rights climate and U.S.-Brazil cooperation. There's another resolution that's been introduced by a broad number of members that expresses concerns about human rights, rule of law, democracy, and the environment. We've seen several letters come out of our Congress, including in May 2019, one by 54 members of Congress writing to Secretary Pompeo before his trip to Brazil that they're deeply concerned for Bolsonaro's contempt in terms of the rights of indigenous and Afro community, and asking him to put human rights at the forefront of the US-Brazil relationship. They also cited their concern about the growing number of indigenous leaders who are killed and the weakening of protection of their collective land rights. We've seen that the Congressional Black Caucus has started taking on Afro-Brazilian issues again. And in the last Congressional Black Caucus annual meeting, there was actually a panel where there was discussion about the expansion of the Alcantara military base, violence and racism against Afro-Brazilians and trans persons. So this meeting of the minds is something that we need to be pretty concerned about as we start between the US and Brazil deepening more commercial and political arrangements. And especially since our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, started last year something called the Commission on Unalienable Rights that focuses on natural law and is basically a code word for trying to roll back a historic role that the US has had as a global human rights defender, and that could have some severe repercussions in terms of LGBT and anti-reproductive rights. And Brazil's interest in that commission is something we need to look at. So in order to understand all of this better, to know which way we should move forward and what are the best steps we can take, it is important that we understand more in depth exactly how much of Bolsonaro's campaign promises and blustering rhetoric has actually been put into practice in Brazil. And to help us with that task today are our distinguished speakers, which are Maria Herminia Tavares de Almeida, who is a senior researcher at the Centro Brasileiro de Análisis y Planejamiento, a professor at the University of Sao Paulo on international relations and political science, and who forms part of the ARNS Commission. After Maria, we will hear from Camila Asano, who is the Conectas, a human rights organization in Brazil's program coordinator, and the recipient of the ALEP, I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, the Sao Paulo Legislative Assembly's Lobo Human Rights Award for Women. And last but not least, we have Carlos Quesada, the director of the International Institute for Race and Equality, who is a prominent advocate who's been advocating for Afro-Latino rights and LGBT rights for the past 25 years. So without further ado, let's start with Maria Herminia.
Good afternoon. I'm very honored and pleased to be here to talk about these issues with you, with the public, and I'm very grateful to WOLA for this invitation. Camila and I have decided that I would present a broader picture of the Brazil under Bolsonaro, and she would address the human rights issue. So this is what I'm going to do. Actually, coronavirus hit Brazil in a very bad moment. We were still trying to cope with the economic crisis and tough fiscal restrictions. The unemployment rates were around 12%. Poverty and inequality were growing since 2015, 2016. In political terms, today, we actually don't have a president in any meaningful sense of the word. The man who sits in Brasilia at the president's chair is not a president, but a chief of a extreme right minority political faction. He talks and acts to please this faction and to keep this faction faithful to him. I will ask Lisette to show a picture I would like everybody to see. Can you show it, please? This is a summer lunch at Bolsonaro's house in Brasilia. He and his 3 sons live in this environment. You can see the pictures with a machine gun. The other pictures in the wall show the world where this man lives. Okay, this is the only picture I would like to show, and I think it says a lot about the character and the inclinations of the man who sits in the chair of the president without being really one. Bolsonaro has gotten during the elections around 55% of the valid ballots and has now a positive evaluation of something between 28% and 35% of the public opinion, according to different opinion polls. 1/3 of the Brazilians, and not less, but not more than 1/3 of the Brazilians today support Bolsonaro's politics. Nevertheless, this 1/3 has shown some stability since last year. He has not lost support. He has not gained support. Actually, Bolsonaro's government has no strong political opposition to his government. The fiercest opposition comes from inside, comes from the president office and his clique and his sons. They are also right-wing politicians. It's Bolsonaro who, during the 2019, during the whole last year, created all the major political crises regarding his government. So today we face a peculiar situation of having a presidential system without a president. And when the coronavirus arrived here, Bolsonaro was a hindrance, actually. He disdained the dangerous consequences of the pandemics. He opposed measures of safety, of health safety. And he didn't propose any positive measures, any positive policies. His government countervailing measures, either in healthcare or in protecting citizens' income and jobs, came late and were too limited. All has been done up to now, to all that has been done up to now to confront the pandemic is due to the Congress, and that has negotiated with parts of the government, with the Ministry of Economy, with the Ministry of Health, and actually improved some proposals that came from the Ministry of Economy, extending, for instance, the basic income measures, improving some proposals that came from the government. Bolsonaro has no interest whatsoever in this kind of policies, and during the whole time, he actually act against some important measures that should be taken to protect the citizens. Actually, the Congress, some parts of his government, governors and mayors are the major actors of the play nowadays, where governors and mayors of huge cities, of the biggest cities in Brazil, who have imposed lockdown measures, have import equipments, have built campaign hospital. This is a very decentralized reaction, which poses important limitations to confront the pandemics, since it poses important coordination problems. States have different administrative capacities, even if the health system in Brazil is a national one. What I'm saying is that the responses to the crisis could be much more efficient, could be much more broader if the government and the president didn't continually did not sabotage the fight against the coronavirus. Up to now, Bolsonaro has shown more rhetorical than effective capacity to manage democracy and democratic institutions, since his authoritarian impulses have been countervailed by the Congress, by the Supreme Court, by the liberal press, by parts of the liberal media, and by organized civil societies. Nevertheless, he keeps escalating his authoritarian rhetorics. This last weekend, he participated against the recommendations of the health authorities. He has participated in a public meeting just in front of the army. How to say that, of the army building, and asking a meeting that call for closing the Congress, closing the Supreme Court, imposing authoritarian measures. He didn't say that, but he actually stimulated the people who were in the meeting to say this horrible kind of things. Up to now, I think the major democratic institutions were able to contain him and to contain his impulse toward authoritarianism. But of course, this puts enormous stress on institutions, and especially on the more vulnerable individuals and organizations in our society. He was only partially he could only partially impose his agenda. I think that the hugest part of his agenda, which was actually destroying democracy, he couldn't do it. But he caused a lot of problems and a lot of threats to the most vulnerable groups in Brazilian society. And I'll give the floor to Camila to told you a little bit more in details what were the measures that actually hurted the Brazilian most vulnerable groups. Up to this moment, I think the president is a little bit isolated in his most nefarious intents, but he has already caused a lot of trouble, and at this moment of the pandemics, also a lot of pain to the Brazilian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, WOLA, for the invitation. Good afternoon to all that is following this webinar. I'm really grateful to be here with all of you and to talk about Brazil. And Jimena, in her initial question, she asked to talk about Bolsonaro administration, and now we are completing almost 16 months of Bolsonaro as president, or as Maria Hermínia said, sitting at the presidential chair, but for sure not behaving and not ruling the country as you expect a president to do. So in these 16 months, what we could see is Bolsonaro keeping his promise and really put in place his campaign promises. And when he was elected based on a platform attacking democratic institutions. His platform was also disregarding minority rights and also attacking vulnerable groups in Brazil. And all of his electoral platform was really put into place after he took office in January 2019. So what we've been seeing for this past 16 months is our democracy, the Brazilian democracy that's quite young and still being consolidated. The Brazilian democracy is being at risk for different cases, and Maria Hermínia was very direct to the point when she was presenting the way that Bolsonaro and his whole administration and his hardcore supporter, which includes his family, his 3 sons, are operating and attacking in different times democracy in Brazil. So we had what we can call in Brazil an authoritarian populist president. And it's not new, it couldn't be different to have during this COVID-19 pandemic a different reaction than a populist authoritarian measures from Bolsonaro. So we've been seeing since the pandemic starting to its hard moments in Brazil. We have the president going to public, giving interviews, diminishing the gravity of the pandemic and saying that it's just a little flu. He also said that it's kind of a fantasy, or even blaming the press for creating hysteria in the Brazilian society. So attacking the press is not new. He's been attacking the journalists and the freedom of the press for a while, and it's not different, wouldn't be different now during the pandemic. He's also questioning all the time the WHO authorities and measures, and even disregarding the measures from his own Minister of Health. He even fired the Minister of Health because he was considered someone that was really following sanitarian and health authorities and following the WHO recommendations. So we can say that we are not only having health crisis as many or all countries are facing now during the pandemic. In Brazil, we have the health crisis combined with a political crisis. And this political crisis is not a matter of two different groups disputing power, but actually it's a political crisis attacking the foundations of democracy. So the example that Maria just mentioned of just now, last Sunday, Bolsonaro attended a public demonstration in front of the army headquarters. So gathering people in this time of social distancing and in this time of stay-at-home order, he went to that demonstration to even shake hands with some people, and also it wasn't any demonstration. It was a demonstration calling for military intervention. It was a demonstration calling for the closure of the Congress and the Supreme Court in Brazil. So it's been even now investigated by the Public Attorney Office in Brazil because of all the financing of this demonstration, but not the role of the president in going and attending these demonstrations. So all the measures that we've been seeing during this pandemic have this trace and these aspects of authoritarian measures, and also trying to disconnect proper public policies and proper public response to a situation like the one we are living with the COVID-19 pandemic. And what it's doing is stressing all the time the democratic institutions. So I'll go through some examples of concrete measures that Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro administration implemented during the pandemic, and showing how it's being all the time attacking democratic values, or even not being targeting really the protection of lives, protection of the health of the population, but again talking to his small supportive group, as Maria said, and all the time making it something political, or even making it electoral, already looking forward to his re-election, which is obviously a goal for Bolsonaro in 2022. So one thing that Bolsonaro did in the early days of the pandemic here in Brazil was presenting a lawsuit that the Supreme Court in Brazil, asking for to eliminate the time limit of the executive orders, what we call here medidas provisórias. So if the Supreme Court decided in favor of his request, in practice, would have Bolsonaro like Orban in Hungary, like ruling the country, and without the control of the Congress. And in this case, the Supreme Court was really doing what was necessary and decided to suspend and to not receive and accept this. But now the Supreme Court is deciding, it started today, this ruling. Also, what we saw here was an attack to the Freedom of Information Act in Brazil. So one of the first executive orders of Bolsonaro was to suspend the Freedom of Information law that we have here. Again, we have the Supreme Court suspending his executive order and doing the checks and balance and controlling this abusive active action of Bolsonaro. So it's not new. It's not only from this pandemic moment, but this characteristic of Bolsonaro attacking democratic institutions and stressing the democratic institution, forcing them to react to his authoritarian measures, is really not something limited to the pandemic period, but this is something that's coming from since the beginning of his administration. We also had very concerning things happening with the measures Bolsonaro took place regarding vulnerable groups in Brazil. So I would like to talk about four vulnerable groups in Brazil and show how the decisions of Bolsonaro administration is actually putting these populations more at risk during the pandemic instead of protecting these vulnerable groups. So the first one is the prison population, and Brazil is one of the countries with the largest prison population in the world. So we are in the third place, considering the number of prisoners and inmates here. And instead of following what the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is recommending, or the UN specialists are recommending on disincarceration, the authorities in Brazil, especially the Minister of Justice, Sérgio Moro, he's refusing to adopt more concrete measures to release some of these inmates that could, by law, be already serving other types of sentence and not incarcerated, because we know that these prisons will be places where it will be almost impossible to control the dissemination of the disease. The other vulnerable groups is the workers in general, and this is again not something only from this moment of the pandemic, but since the beginning of the administration, Bolsonaro has been attacking the labor rights and attacking especially those poor workers and eliminating or many protections for the workers. And after again, in the early days of the pandemic in Brazil, one executive measure was to allow companies to suspend the labor contracts and even to not pay salaries for up to 2 months. So when many countries, or almost all countries, are finding ways to protect jobs and protect the workers, Bolsonaro decided to really make it very flexible and put these people in a very worrying situation. The third group that I wanted to raise here is the refugees and the migrants. Of course, because of the pandemic, it's necessary to have some restrictions and border controls. This is part of the tough measures that we all are having to adopt. But instead of only restricting, aiming to protect from the dissemination of the coronavirus, in the decrees, the Minister of Justice decided to, for example, eliminate the possibility of someone to apply for asylum in Brazil. So if you manage to if you manage to arrive in Brazil because you are fleeing from conflicts or from war or even a humanitarian crisis, once you're here, you will not be allowed to stay here or to even request asylum here in Brazil. So this is a clear violation from the Brazilian refugee law and also the UN Convention. And this is again not new. Bolsonaro was attacking the protections of refugees for a while and even trying to destroy the migration law. That's quite a new law adopted in 2017. So he's been using as an excuse the pandemic to advance an agenda of restricting rights of refugees and migrants. And the last but not least group is the indigenous population. So since the beginning of the administration, we've been seeing severe attacks against the protection of indigenous populations here. And during this pandemic, it's very worrying on how he's going to protect, because even in the case of quilombolas, that's a traditional Afro-descendant communities in Brazil, descendants from the slaves in Brazil, Bolsonaro in the early days of the pandemic, the federal government announced that there would be eviction of a community in the state of Maranhão. In the end, all the authorities were able to manage and control and to postpone at least this eviction. But these traditional populations, including quilombolas and the indigenous population, were already at risk before the pandemic under Bolsonaro administration, and of course now the situation is not changing. So I would stop here and say that the situation in Brazil is very concerning. We already have more than 43,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus contamination and 2,700 deaths. But this number can be really far from the reality because we are not properly testing population here, and we are having many cases of bodies that are buried without the confirmation if it was COVID or not. So we do have a health crisis here, and things are even worse with these constant attacks against our democracy and fundamental rights here. Thank you for the attention.
Sorry, thank you very much. I would like to thank Camila and Maria for your inputs, and I would like to thank Jimena Sanchez and Jeff for organizing this with us here. I think a crisis tests leadership, and I think it also exposes and exacerbates structural inequalities, and that's what I would like to talk here. And I mean, it has been very clear here in the United States that the virus does not affect everybody at the same, everybody at the same time. I mean, in the same way. I'm sorry. Just some few facts here. 52 to 54 of the 215 million people in Brazil are Afro-Brazilians, whereas in the United States, African Americans represent between 13 and 14 to 14% of the 330 million people that we had, last year. However, I think it will be important to say that both in the United States and Brazil, there has been like historical discrimination against Afro-Brazilians, and until now. And as I said before, I think a crisis like the coronavirus, it exacerbates these structural inequalities. I would like just to mention that according to the Brazilian Society of Family Medicine, 67% of those Brazilians using the Sistema Único da Saúde, the unique health system in Brazil, are Blacks. And there have been studies that demonstrate that most of them have what we call here in the United States pre-existing conditions, such as diabetes, tuberculosis, TB, hypertension, and other renal chronic diseases. So Afro-Brazilians, have been at risk in terms of health in general, and now they're more exposed, so to speak, right now because of the pandemic. And the big question that people have been asking here, especially in states like New York, and I would like actually to say the same question in Brazil is who can practice social distance, and especially when the majority of the Afro-Brazilian population live in favelas, crowded with other relatives, and with with lack to access to hygienic conditions, or a lot of them do not have adequate healthcare access, or very poor housing conditions. And another big problem in Brazil too has been the lack of access to nutritious food for Afro-Brazilians or the poor. That the case in Brazil is like the majority of the population is Afro-Brazilian. I think when Jair Bolsonaro has been promoted what it's called like vertical isolation, where only people at risk can stay at home, it's kind of a contradiction, because for him, people at risk are those who are 60 year old plus, and so clearly he didn't know about, or he doesn't recognize the structural situation of the Afro-Brazilian population. Talking to our partners, especially those we work a lot with the Rede Negra LGBT in Brazil, Galadés, Instituto da Mulher Negra in Sao Paulo, and Criolla in Rio de Janeiro, and Associação Nacional de Pessoas Travestis e Transsexuais do Brazil, ANTRA. They're very concerned because apparently, it seems that there are not concrete policies to stop the virus where the majority of Afro-Brazilians live. Either it's a favela or it's like around the cities. And the Black Coalition of Rights, for instance, and there is this leader, Douglas Belchor, has been calling for a more to strengthen, to strengthen the public health system. And again, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, there has been like a lack, like this crisis has been a kind of a test for Bolsonaro, where apparently he's actually failing. I would say actually that the media has been the one who has been very outspoken a bit about how the mortality rate is higher among the Afro-Brazilian population. There was an interesting article like last week in Folha de Sao Paulo about how the mortality rate was higher for Afro-Brazilians, and even though they represent one of every 4 hospitalizations, they die is one for every 3 that dies. But the same report also kind of exposes something different. That is, Brazil is very good at having data based on race, but when there were 1,055 or 56 cases of dead people, the race question or the race variable was not included. So the mortality rate probably is actually higher than the one that I was mentioned based on that report, because they were in the first up to April 10th, they were not collecting. The Ministry of Health was not collecting data based on race. So in terms of the health system, I would say that based on the pre-existing conditions of the Afro-Brazilian population, and based on the poverty, the structural poverty in which they are involved, they are at a higher risk. And again, it seems not to be a public policy towards that. Talking about the LGBT population, I would like to remind that according to the Grupo Gay da Bahia, GBB, there were 420 killings in Brazil for murders against LGBTI individuals. According to the National Association of Pessoas Transsexuais Travestis, ANTRA, only in 2019 there were 124 killings of trans in Brazil. Brazil is the country in the world that kills more LGBT people, and that's very concerning. It's very concerning precisely because what Maria and Camila said, that actually happened during the electoral process, and a lot of the comments that the president have said about, a lot of racist comments, a lot of homophobic comments that the president publicly has said. Going back again to the current health crisis, we are very concerned because, for instance, according to ANTRA, our partner, they have been receiving complaints from a lot of trans sex workers, who have said in the last 3 weeks that their pimps have not been allowing her to be off the streets. So basically, they have been forced to still work as sex workers, so putting them at risk. But the other problem has been said that in some cases also a lot of the sex workers could not have the luxury of not work on the streets because they have to pay their room. Most of them living in a room in a house. They have to pay the aluguel, the rent in Brazil. There are some small positive steps, like in Rio de Janeiro and in Salvador. There is a Casa Nem, which is a shelter for homeless LGBTI people that actually in the last 3 weeks has been overflown by people who want to live there. Unfortunately, they don't have the capacity to host more than 90 people. And there is a Casa Aurora in Salvador that is facing the same problem, but that's a positive step. And according to ANTRA too, ANTRA has been organizing, they have been organizing some food banks where they have been able to bring food to some of the trans women that have been able to be off the streets, but they don't have the money to buy food. And just to highlight, this is just kind of the headlines here too. There is like an increase in the rate of domestic violence in Brazil. And we are very, very concerned, since we've been working a lot on the situation of Afro-descendant women, because it has been proven, and it's not new, that, for instance, the Maria da Penha law has been able to decrease violence for white women in Brazil, but not for Black women in Brazil. And just kind of a headline there that I would like to mention. And in the case of a lot of LGBTI individuals, for instance, they haven't been able actually to also practice social distancing because of the homophobia and transphobia that they face in their own homes. So they either have to go to live with friends or among them, or unfortunately, some of them have to live on the streets. I don't have a lot of time, so I just want to end with 3 concrete recommendations. The first one is to recommend the Congressional Black Caucus and the Equality Caucus to actually push our government here in the United States to work to kind of activate or reactivate the U.S. Brazil Joint Action Plan to eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination, especially because there is a clause on health, where apparently the 2 countries where we're supposed to help each other in terms of how to eliminate racial discrimination or racial disparities for Afro descendants in the health system. The second one is, and I think Camila mentioned it too, to recommend the Brazilian government to actually comply with the guidelines of the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization. Those guidelines in order to stop the spread of the virus in Brazil. And finally, 2 days ago, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the rapporteur on LGBT rights, came out with some recommendations for member states of the Organization of American States, including to respect and condemn discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity to member states. And among the recommendations is that they actually recommend the states to include LGBTI in social assistance programs, especially for homeless LGBTI people and sex workers in the country. And finally, just to mention that, we've been working again in order to raise the visibility of Afro-Brazilians and Afro-LGBTI people in Brazil with the partners that I was mentioning in the past, both to the UN system and the Organization of American States. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our 3 excellent panelists on their succinct and very timely presentations. Before I go to questions from the audience, which can be sent at Brazil WOLA, I would like to just say a few recommendations of our own, which are basically as follows. First, we think it's very important that everybody start educating themselves and coming up to speed on the human rights situation in Brazil and its multi-dimensions. We've set up a group called the Brazil Human Rights Working Group. It's a Google group to share information and to organize around. And we're happy to include folks who want to be on that. You can contact me if you want to be added. It's important that we help raise awareness of what's going on in the United States at a much broader level, and that folks begin contacting their members of Congress, not just the Congressional Black Caucus and the Equality Caucus, but also our 2 Native American representatives in the Congress and anyone who has oversight over Latin American relations or appropriations or defense funds. It's important that they understand that these issues are important to you and that you would like to make sure that they are monitoring, that they're holding Brazil accountable, and that should anything advance, like a free trade agreement, that it contains conditions and strong restrictions when it comes to labor, environmental, and indigenous and Afro-descendant rights. We really need to start organizing a lot more about this and bringing in far more people, because this is a battle that will have to be working together. Lastly, it's important just to say that by holding Brazil accountable, we're really holding the US accountable, because given this extensive interrelationship that is growing and meeting of minds, one hand is helping the other one out. And we don't want to see these sorts of measures in the United States as well. So with that brief set of recommendations, we've gotten a bunch of questions, and my colleagues have been summarizing them for me. I'm going to basically put out 3 questions and let our panelists answer. And then if we have more time, we'll go through more. So Maria Herminia noted that Brazil is currently a presidential system without a president. At this current global crisis, Bolsonaro continues to adamantly oppose public health measures to contain the pandemic. Progress has mostly been achieved in spite of him by mayors and governors. Can you give more examples of creative ways that Brazilian states, in one of Latin America's most extensive federal systems, has been able to respond to the crisis? So that's question number 1 for Maria. The second question is that Camila highlighted vulnerable groups affected by Bolsonaro's response to the pandemic. And this raises the question of who and who cannot practice social distancing. This was something that Carlos had talked about. But another group that any of the panelists can talk about would be people with disabilities and how they're faring in this situation. Lastly, Bolsonaro is acting to give himself more power to enact executive orders and to suspend the Freedom of Information law. The Supreme Court is refusing to hear these cases. So what can Brazilians, especially those that are most vulnerable, do to disseminate fact-based information about the pandemic? So we'll start with those. If you want to, maybe Maria Herminia first.
You're muted.
Yeah. Thank you for these very interesting questions. First of all, I think that we should remember that in the last 20, 25 years, Brazil has organized, has had a huge amount of organizations for popular participation, generally linked to social policies. So you have the health committees, the education committees, social assistance committees, and all that. Part of this has been destroyed by Bolsonaro. All that were established in law, but only by presidential decree, have been destroyed by Bolsonaro. The other part still exists and is a very important tool for giving capillarity to the healthcare system and the social assistance system at this moment. The programs like the communitary agents, for instance, there are people from a community that work inside the healthcare system, have been very important in order to give information, to help communities to organize, to try to find ways of coping with this issue that Carlos has emphasized, that isolation is very difficult for people who lived in very poor communities, in very crowded communities. But we have in the basis of society a lot of agents of working to trying to minimize this disadvantage. This is part of our healthcare system. But I think we should stress this, because I think it is a very important tool in order to arrive to people in different circumstances. Naturally, this capacity is not the same in the whole Brazilian territories. So there are parts of Brazil where the capacity to reach poor, disadvantaged people is much less important than in other parts of Brazil, and I think this is it's a real problem. From the point of view of the more institutionalized politics, I think this has been a very important movement of governors to coordinate their action. There is a forum of Northeast governors that try to cope together with the issues of lack of equipment, with the need of import some tests, import some equipment. And so I think this is a movement that actually began previously to the pandemic, but today is helping to minimize this disadvantage of not having a national coordination of the struggle against pandemic. So, summarizing, I think there are lots of things happening at the basis of society and connected to the health, public health institutions on one hand, and on the other hand, there has been some kind of coordination among governors that work in the same direction.
Well, on the question on those who cannot practice social distancing, we have always to have in mind that Brazil is a very unequal country. So inequality in Brazil is something that's part of even the all relations that we have here. And since we had even Temer administration, the previous president, and now with Bolsonaro, inequality is growing and growing fast. And this is because we have many social programs that are being dismantled. Also, protections of informal workers, also even social security being dismantled in this past year. So in the end, it's resulting in more inequality here. So who are the people that cannot practice social distance? This is the people that are the poor population. They are working, even though businesses are closed and schools are closed, we still have, for instance, domestic workers. So this is a reality in Brazil. Many houses, they have domestic workers, and it's mainly Black women. There are these domestic workers, and they were not released by their, I don't know how to say, the employers from these domestic workers, and not even being provided proper protection equipment like masks or there. So every day they are getting public transportation, going to the subways, and serving the families that employ them. So this is one example of how inequality is going to, of course, affect more the poor people here in Brazil. Also, we are very concerned about the rural workers. So Connectas has a long partnership with a trade union of workers working with the coffee plantation, because there was a case of contemporary form of slavery, and we are working with this trade union of rural workers. And I don't know how to say it in English, maybe harvest the coffee, it's now. So this is the moment that we have this worker have to harvest, to collect the coffee from the coffee plantation. So what are the protections that these companies and even the final buyers, us as consumers, but even big coffee shops that are gonna buy these products, what are the the protection that they're providing for these workers. So we have, when we talk about social distance, of course, we're talking about essential services being continuing here, and this is the really worker class. And we are not seeing a very proper and adequate measures from the employers, the big companies, or even, in the case of domestic workers from these wealth families in Brazil. On the question on the freedom of information and other things, I must say that the Supreme Court is actually doing their job. So the Supreme Court decided in a preliminary way to suspend the executive order limiting the freedom of information law, and the Supreme Court also decided to not accept the request from the Bolsonaro administration to rule using only executive orders, and that was we call decisões liminares, so precautionary decisions. But now, like today, it's about to start the session from the Supreme Court to decide on the action number 663. That's the one that the Bolsonaro asked the Supreme Court the allowance to rule without limit of the executive order. So until now, we are seeing the democratic institutions, National Congress, and the judiciary being able to block some of the abuses. But again, this is all the time stressing the democratic institutions, and we don't know until when they'll be able to do the check and balance and control these abusive measures.
Jimena, I know that we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to mention three things very briefly. One, I think that Camila mentioned in her first presentation a little bit, but I like to emphasize is the fact that in Brazil there are like a lot of indigenous groups that have been having limited contact with people, and those are very vulnerable. And even the UN has said that please protect those. I mean, what happened here in the 15th century when the Europeans came, a lot of them actually were killed because of the pandemics. So there is a need in Brazil to protect those who have limited contact so far, because it's going to be like a massacre literally in Brazil. The other thing that I'm very concerned is the fact that and we didn't have the time to talk about it, but Brazil hasn't reached the peak yet. I mean, I'm very concerned, when we talk to our partners, it's because of the inequalities, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and transphobia, is who's gonna get the best treatment in Brazil. If I'm poor, I'm Black, and trans, for instance, and if there is like a white Brazilian, who's gonna get better treatment in Brazil? I think those are questions that I already know the answer. Unfortunately, I mean, obviously the white Brazilian is gonna get better treatment in Brazil. And so this is something that we need to monitor with. I mean, I know that Connect Us and other organizations, but I think we need to be vigilant because I mean, there is this policy of denial still. Like, a lot of people are not gonna die, etc. I mean, we have more than 45,000 people in the US, and we're trying to do something. And I think in Brazil, the government is not doing enough, and unfortunately is also putting obstacles to those governors that want to do something. So that's a big problem, and I think we need to monitor the situation.
Well, thank you so much to our three excellent panelists, and thank you to everyone who participated in this webinar. We will continue to be in touch about these pressing issues. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay.